Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with our good friend, Brian McLaren. Brian's an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian, a former college English teacher and pastor. He's a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity, just, generous, and working with people of all faiths for the common good. He's a core faculty member and dean of faculty for the Center for Action and Contemplation and a podcaster with Learning How to See. He's also an Auburn Senior Fellow and co-host of Southern Lights. His books include Faith After Doubt, Do I Stay Christian, Why Don't They Get It, Overcoming Bias in Others and Yourself, and The Seventh Story, Us, Them, and the End of Violence. His latest book that we're going to talk about today is Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. Brian was awarded a Doctor of Divinity degree from Carey Theological Seminary in Vancouver and a second honorary doctorate from Virginia Theological Seminary. Brian and I have collaborated on all kinds of different things. He spoke at several of our writers' conferences and Compassion Christianity. He contributed to one of the How to Heal Our Divides books, which I appreciated very much. And we co-founded a project called Raising Kids for Good. You can learn more about Brian and all of his great work at brianmclaren.net. So Brian, it's so wonderful to see you again. Many congratulations on all of the wonderful things that you've done.
Well, and same to you, my friend. Getting the two Bryans back together feels like getting the band back together. So
Does. I,
good to be
yeah,
with you, my
I,
friend.
I have appreciated our collaboration so very much. And I appreciate how you help so many people, and
Well,
collaborate with
thanks.
so many people so helpfully. And that's really a role model in that regard,
Thank you.
without question.
Thanks.
So what else would you like people to know about you than this, kind of canned introduction that I did?
Well, obviously, all those are good things. I have five amazing grandkids and four adult kids. And this summer, we're meeting up at a beautiful place called Ring Lake Ranch, where I'm doing some speaking, but they're going to come. And so we'll be riding horses and fly fishing and hiking and all kinds of fun stuff. So that's something I'm looking forward to this summer.
I'll have to remember that as a potential destination to take
Oh,
my family
I
to too.
I I couldn't tell you how great it is. It's just wonderful. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. I hope you have a fantastic time there with them.
Thank you.
So today we want to talk about a couple of different things. The first one is the book that I mentioned,
Yes.
Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. So this is quite a book. And I would say a departure, in some ways from the other books that you've written. How did this book come about?
Yes, the connection this has, the tightest connection with any of my previous books is back in 2007, 2008, I had a book come out called Everything Must Change.
Mm.
And that book grew out of the previous book that was called The Secret Message of Jesus. And so I, had been a pastor. I was a pastor at that time and just finishing up my 24 years as a pastor in the pastorate. And I had become convinced that Jesus' primary message was not about where we go after we die, but about God's will, God's desires, God's dreams coming true for earth while we're alive, which raised for me the question, well, if we're supposed to join God in the healing of the world, as my rabbi friends say, they call this tikkun olam, participating with God in the healing of the world.
Mm.
Um, what's the state of the world? And, there's lots of problems, but I wanted to understand which are symptoms of deeper problems and which problems are the most serious. So that immersed me in a 2-year research project about global crises. And I kind of stayed with that in the years since, trying to keep up with uh, the, uh, the best thinking on our global situation. Um, and so that really sowed the seeds for this book now, you know, getting close to 20 years later from doing that research. And, but it was intensified in the last couple of years by growing awareness of global warming, uh, combined with our political polarization, which seems to keep us from being able to politically solve our biggest problems. We tend to go chasing after distractions, rabbit trails, what some people call weapons of mass distraction, where we keep so focused on little fires that we miss the big fire. And continuing concentration of wealth and power among a smaller and smaller number of people, which is related to resurgence of white supremacy and authoritarianism. You look at this cocktail of problems, and more people are feeling this sense of doom. Doom meaning that our problems have outgrown our institutional capacities to solve them. And each one of our problems makes the others harder to solve. I was feeling that. I saw friends of mine feeling it. I and I felt just somehow called that I should try to grapple with it.
Wow. Well, the book paints a rather bleak view of our civilization's future, which had to be difficult to write, I would suspect.
Well, yeah. I mean, one way to say it is that I tried to depict four scenarios, uh, one of which I think most people would consider is the most hopeful scenario, three that are increasing levels of serious trouble, um, and uh, and if I could have seen another easier scenario, I would have I would have been glad to talk about it. But I think we're at a point, and for me as a former pastor and a committed Christian, this kind of makes special sense, because what I feel like I'm coming to realize is that we human beings really need saving. Maybe not in the old hellfire and brimstone sense, but we are in trouble and we need help to get out. And a big part of that help involves a deep inner change in our values, in our way of seeing, and our in the priority of love in our lives. So in one sense, that can look bleak, but in another sense, it feels like it's bringing me back to things that I've always believed are deeply important. I just feel now they're even more urgently important.
Hmm. Hmm. So, what kind of reactions are you getting from the book with the people that have read it so far? I know it's not released yet,
Yes,
as we speak, but I know a lot of people like myself have read it
yes. Well,
because of the peer copies.
I think there are two categories of reactions. For people who already have been grappling with these issues for some years, I'd say the when people talk to me, the word they use is relief. It feels like a relief to create a space, albeit a literary space, but a space where we can think and talk about the seriousness and interrelatedness of our problems, and to talk about the feeling of doom. I'm in the book, I'm not predicting any kind of apocalypse in some kind of traditional sense of a world-ending event. But I'm acknowledging a feeling that many of us have, that that our problems are very, very serious, and that there's no easy way out of them. I remember a lot of people would know the name Bill McKibben,
Yeah.
and Bill and I were talking a couple years ago, and I said to him, Bill, it feels like we're not playing to win right now. We're just playing to not lose too badly, and to minimize the harm of the loss. And so uh, yeah, certain people say it's just a relief to be able to talk honestly about this. I think if we honestly can talk about our situation, we increase the chances that we'll have better outcomes. And if we can't honestly talk about it, I think we increase the chance of worse outcomes.
Yeah.
So that's one common reaction. The other common reaction is from people who this is kind of new to, and they kind of say, "Wow, that kind of was a wake up call," and it was a little bit uncomfortable. I remember one reader, lovely person, a deeply committed Christian. She wrote me after receiving the book, and she said, "This book is going to end on a note of hope, isn't it?" And and I know she was kind of worried. And so I emailed her back and I said, "Listen, if you don't want to read the book, no pressure. You don't have to read it." I said, one of the chapters in the book is called Hope is Complicated. And so I said, you might want to read that chapter first. So since then, we've had emails going back and forth, and she's told me how in a certain sense she felt that to be a good Christian meant that she had to assume that everything would always work out fine, right? And and there is a certain part of that that's beautiful and is positive and that is uplifting. But there's also a part of it that, it's, she happens to be, well, I think her Christian faith makes her feel that is uh, a faithful outlook. But there are an awful lot of people who've had to go through not just 1 year or 10 years or 50 years, but they've had to go through generations of hardship before they get to a better time. And so, so I think that was a little bit discomforting for her, and I'm sure for many other readers. But I also think, yeah, I think people feel like we do need to think about this from multiple angles.
Yeah, there's no question about that. It made me think from
Yeah.
multiple angles after I read it. And I think it's probably more underlined and dog-eared than any book that I've read,
Mhm. Mhm.
which says a lot.
Yes. Well,
So my impression was that you had to do a ton of research
yes.
to do this book. Can you talk about some of the key sources that you used?
Sure. Well, there, maybe off the top of my head, there are three categories of resources for looking at our global situation and global crises. There is specialist work. So, for example, there are people who devote their entire lives not just to studying the climate change, and not just to studying the cryosphere or the ice around our Earth, which turns out to be way more important than most people realize as a kind of planetary climate regulator. And not just glaciers and not just ice caps, but they study one particular stretch of ice cap on one particular isthmus of Greenland, you know. So
Mm,
you
mm,
have the work of specialists. And very often specialists, to do their job well, don't have time to pay attention to what other people are talking about in different fields. I am super nerdy in this way. So I love finding out what specialists say about ice caps and about coral reefs and about kelp forests and about regeneration of soil. So I have been able to just follow my curiosity in all of those areas. And the people who do this work, I mean, I just think we ought to like give a salute to scientists because it's such incredibly important work. I, through the years, have volunteered with a lot of scientists. It's just something I love. For example, in about 2 weeks, I'll be going out for my first time this season. I do sea turtle monitoring, and I
mhm,
work with a group of scientists and volunteers who are amassing huge banks of data to help us understand how sea turtle populations can rebound and stay healthy and strong. So all of that work. Then there are journalists who very often they're science journalists who try to integrate the work across many fields. And the great thing about them is they're often, I mean, they're such skilled writers to take complicated information and synthesize
yeah,
it. So that would be a second kind of research. Actually, I'm going to make it four. A third is very often the most recent data is not available in books. You know, it takes a year
mm,
to publish a
sure.
book. So then you just keep up with the important sources. And there are certain podcasts that try to keep you up with the latest. There are certain YouTube channels, often by scientists doing the research, and even groups like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have working groups and they put their meetings online so you can
Mm,
hear the science while it's unfolding. And that I have found absolutely fascinating. And then the fourth, I should add, that's important to me. There are theologians who are doing, and philosophers who are doing deep thinking about the ways of thinking and the kinds of belief systems and value systems that have gotten us into the mess we're in. And they're doing really important and creative philosophical and theological work about the shifts in our own consciousness or understanding that are necessary. Sorry to turn that into a little
No,
lecture, but
no,
yeah,
that's really important things. And it's like one of the things I like about your book is that you note a lot of those, like your footnotes or your references, to all about these organizations or podcasts or whatever. And so I've subscribed to several things,
yes.
that I'd never heard of before from reading your book. So I'm trying to learn at least, a small subset and nowhere near what you have about this.
Well, and of course, everything that I touched, you come to realize, oh my gosh, there are people who've devoted 20
Yeah.
years of their life to this one research area. But, I don't know if you feel this way, Brian, but it feels like, gosh, for all of my life, I've lived on this planet. I kind of I wish in my science classes and other classes,
Yeah.
I'd gotten a better understanding of how it works. I mean, I took geology and earth science wasn't even a thing when I was in school. I would have loved it if I could have taken it. But at any rate, it's nice gaining a greater understanding of this amazing, beautiful living planet we're part of.
Most of us, our knowledge is so superficial and so
Yeah.
thin, when there's, as you said, an immense amount of depth
Yes.
out there. Maybe artificial intelligence will help us, be able to assimilate some of that
Consolidate it.
better. I don't know.
We need all the help we can get. I'll just tell you a quick anecdote. After I wrote that book, Everything Must Change, I was in Scotland doing some lecturing. And one of my hosts said to me, I have a neighbor who I really want you to meet. He's one of the foremost scientists studying soil.
Hmm.
So we walked a few blocks from his home in Glasgow, Scotland, and we go into the backyard of this fellow. And when he found out I was interested in ecology and the environment and really interested in soil, oh my goodness. He took me in his backyard, showed me all of his raised bed gardens. He picked up the roots to let me see how the root systems of his plants grow. He told me about his work studying forest ecology, the interaction of tree roots, what are called emergence or lower level plant roots, um, uh, fungal networks, bacteria, mosses, lichens. And I mean, when he got done, you felt like you didn't want to step on the ground. It was holy ground. You know what I mean? It was this sense,
Wow.
this world is amazing, it's just amazing. So it's an
We take it for
inspiring.
granted. I know, at least
Yes.
I mean, there's so much going on that is
Yeah.
completely opaque to us.
Yes.
Or it shouldn't be, I guess, or couldn't. It's not necessary for it to be, but it,
And I'm sure not everybody will ever want to learn about all this, but you get the feeling that for us to have a better relationship with the earth and our fellow creatures, more of us this
yeah.
will need to become more important for more of us. Just another quick example. I'm thinking about this because I was not too far from where you live
Hmm.
a couple of years ago. I was staying with a relative in New Jersey, and the room I was staying in, right at the window was this beautiful white pine tree, and literally 4 feet from the window was a pair of robins making a nest. And
Wow.
over the 3 or 4 days I stayed there, I got to watch stage by stage the nest get built. And I just remember feeling like this is like getting to watch Michelangelo paint a painting, but every robin does it every year, or every pair of robins do it every year. And it's one of these just amazing wonders, that you can't
A
take
lot
for
of
granted.
miraculous things out there that,
Yes.
if you read enough or watch enough documentaries on Netflix or
Yes.
National Geographic Channel, you only begin to get a flavor of some of the
Yes.
ridiculous diversity of our
Yes.
planet and creatures and what all
Yeah.
is going on.
Yeah. You may have heard just this week, some research came out, or an observation came out of an orangutan
Yes,
in Malaysia,
I
who
did
they
read.
found had an eye injury and had chewed up a medicinal plant and put it on the eye. And you think, if that turns out to be a valid observation and not just a fluke, um, then you realize, wow, this has been going on a long time. People have been observing orangutans for a long time, but look at how much was going on that we didn't know.
Yeah, that was the first time that anybody had observed that
Yes. Yeah.
anybody knows of anyway.
Yeah.
That's incredible. So when I read your book, one of my first reactions was how differently you and
Yes.
I react to the climate problem,
Yes.
despite the fact that you and I agree on so many things.
Yes.
So your background, primarily as a pastor, faith-based author, whereas my background is primarily technology and business. So your book deals quite a bit with feelings, such
Yes.
as doom, grief, hope, and hopelessness, as you said,
Yes.
um, stories, fear.
Yes.
Whereas, my first reaction is, well, how do we fix this?
Yes.
What's the technology that can be brought to bear to solve the climate problem?
Yes.
So, and so I started reading, Bill Gates' book about
Yes.
that and, other sources and things. So do you think we need both, or is the latter a waste of time because it's too late?
Yes. So we do need both. And uh, we need both. And we need both at the same time and both in conversation with the other, I think. Um, uh, so just as a kind of health exam for our current engagement with our ecological crisis, um, uh, I'd have to say that science and technology and business are waging the greatest positive response to the problem. To put it cynically, a lot of business leaders are smart enough to see that there's a phenomenal business opportunity. If you could say it like this, we've spent the last 150 years plundering the earth for fun and profit, and a lot of the things we've plundered were at the end of our ability to plunder them for various reasons. In some cases, it's just for yeah, interesting example. When we first started drilling for oil, all the oil was right under the surface. It was easy to get. So your return on investment was huge because it didn't cost you very much to get to the resource that you were going to exploit, right? But now the energy return on investment for fossil fuels is getting it's a worse and worse investment. Now, sadly, the fossil fuel companies are still planning to pump out enough fossil fuels to absolutely destroy us. Like they're acting as if they're going to get away with pumping out everything and burning it all, right? Um, and they want the rest of us to solve that problem. Uh, but the fact is, it's becoming more expensive for them. They have to dig deeper and deeper and harder and more difficult places. So other people in the business world say, shoot, that's not a winning proposition. Let's really invest in solar panels and let's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
invest in wind energy and so amazing breakthroughs are happening. It's one of the few areas where progress is faster than expected. Our ability, for example, to produce solar energy from wind and solar, and our ability to store energy through battery technology,
Yeah.
incredibly positive response there. Um, so those things are really, really important. But we've got to also say that at some point there have to be political decisions. If we wait for the economy and technology to solve the problem alone, here's where our problems become interrelated. There are a few people in the world, you know, the estimates vary, but it's roughly 100 individuals, families, or corporations who own as much wealth as half of the world's people,
Yeah.
as 4
Yeah.
billion people.
Yeah.
So when
Crazy.
those people are acting for their own profit and their own benefit, and they don't really care about the rest of us, right? Then they will keep doing the harmful things faster than others of us can do the helpful things. And so to get political change, we're going to need deep change in more and more people, right? And then to say, well, what if we solve this energy problem, but we don't solve our deeper problem in having a respectful attitude toward the earth itself? Then it's just a matter of time till we throw something else out of whack. And so sooner or later, to me, human civilization is like a 14 or 15-year-old kid that still hasn't grown up, that isn't as mature as it thinks it is. And we're going to have to develop some spiritual maturity about how we live with the earth and one another, of course.
From a technology perspective, one of the things that has struck me is that until recently, and still not anywhere enough, we haven't really tried to solve the problem
Yes.
in a lot of cases. And I think that's
Yes.
why you're seeing a lot of the faster advances that
Yes.
you're seeing, is because there are finally people trying to solve the problem. I mean, I
Yes. Yes.
very loosely, but
Yeah.
specific, like how do we replace concrete, or how do we make geothermal work, or some of these
Yes.
other kinds of things that could have huge payoffs um, in terms of solving the problem.
Yes. Yes. That's very true. And and that's not just true in technology. That's also true in religion. Speaking as a Christian, a whole lot of Christians have spent 99% of their energy over the first 2,000 years of my religion, our religion, trying to help people get into heaven after they die. And one of the ways they did it is they tried to scare people by telling them God's going to destroy the world soon anyway. You'd better be ready to go to heaven when you die. There's no future for you on this world, on this earth anyway. Well, to the degree they're successful in inculcating that belief in people, and people would be surprised to know, there's maybe over 1 billion people of the earth's 8 billion that actually believe that. It might be more than 2 billion people. So there's a lot of people who actually believe that when those people hear about climate change or nuclear war or whatever, they think, if that happens, it will prove my religion is right and our predictions about the end of the world. And you would hope on some deeper level they have some human empathy, but I just don't think it feels real. It all feels to them like the real thing is what happens in church, and somehow and some of them believe, I used to believe this is what I was taught, that before things got really bad, I would be raptured up to heaven anyway. So it's not only science that's new thinking this way, it's new for religion to think this way. Many of our religions too.
Well, religion doesn't have the excuse, because we've been trying to figure that out for literally centuries. Whereas some of this,
Yes.
how do we replace cement?
Yes. And let me just give
A
you
little
another.
newer.
Yes, I'll give you a fascinating example about this. I went to an international conference on ecological civilization several years ago in California. And there were large numbers of people from China and other Asian countries, India, Europe, North America. It was a brilliant global conference. And it was super, super depressing. Like, the message from everybody was, we're going too slow. We're making progress, but it's too slow. There was one talk that I left feeling anything close to inspired when I left. I mean, all the other ones I felt motivated, like, yeah, this is important. But there was an agronomist, someone who specializes in soils and growing plants and the interaction between soil and plants. And one of the things we know that we've got to figure out, we've got about a 12,000 year run of a certain kind of agriculture that involves tilling the soil. It involves every year cutting the soil open, spreading it open before sunlight, which has all kinds of unintended consequences, including making soils susceptible to erosion. So every year we continue with this kind of agriculture, we have less soil left on the planet. And people think, oh, well, they don't understand soil is very different from dirt. And they don't understand that soil is actually a community, a civilization of living and non-living things. And so what this expert said is, we've got 12,000 years of perennial agriculture, the planting and growing of crops of annual agriculture of crops that need to be grown and regrown every year. He said, we've never really devoted ourselves to thinking about perennial agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that the grasses that we have genetically engineered through careful breeding over 12,000 years to produce wheat and corn and so on, they were just grasses when they started. And there are also perennial grasses that you don't need to replant every year. And at the end of his lecture, he took out of a bag a loaf of bread and presented it to the host and organizer of the conference. And he said, this is one of the first loaves of bread produced from wheat that has been grown in a joint research project of agriculture departments in universities around the world to look at how we can selectively breed deep root grasses
Mm.
that grow year after year, and it would revolutionize agriculture and food production. So yes, there are these beautiful things that can be done.
Wow. So, in the book, you say that one of your main mantras for life after doom is mind your mind.
Yes.
So could you talk with us a little bit about that?
Well, as you know, Brian, in fact, you've encouraged me in this writing work of mine. I've been interested in biases, in glitches in human reasoning that have to do with the complexity of our brain and the conflicts of interest that we all have in trying to discern and understand and articulate what's true. And what I've noticed in my work in this area is that my brain wants to go in one of two directions. In the four scenarios I give, I want to go to either scenario one, which says everything will work out, or scenario four that says everything's hopeless. And I don't just notice this in myself, I notice this in a lot of people. Um, and I think there are biases at work in all of
Oh,
our thinking.
absolutely.
And so what it makes me want to do is be aware in a time when it is very, very important for us to know what's actually true and real, that we mind our mind so that we can keep trying to deal with reality. And one of our problems is that here we have our minds and we use them, but we still don't know very much about how our minds work. And psychologists are trying to help us understand this. Neuroscientists are trying to help us understand it. And so one of the things I do in one of the chapters is I try to offer people a scientifically valid, admittedly oversimplified model for thinking about the different parts of our brain and how
Yeah.
we respond to challenging and difficult information. And knowing that, I think, helps all of us respond more wisely.
Hmm. I need to go back and read that again, honestly. I mean, my bias is, as I mentioned to you a minute ago, is like, okay, let's go solve a problem. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And I don't know if that means scenario one or whatever, but that's my bias that I just jump to. And
Yes.
you know,
Well, and to tell you the truth, it's my bias as well.
mm,
And it uh, and I think it probably has to do with our age and other phenomena because we are children of the industrial age. We were shaped by an industry and technology and business, and we don't realize to what degree we are shaped by fossil fuels. And fossil fuels gave this almost magic power to human beings, and figuring out how that influences our thought is one of our challenges at this point.
so I'm going to show one of my biases
Yeah.
here. Because there's this, one potential scenario in my mind that things will get bad enough climate-wise. There'll be some shock to the system that
Yes.
that everybody recognizes and shakes people up and
Yes.
causes action to happen more quickly than what it would or what it has been
Yes.
so far.
Yes.
So do you think, I know you can't predict these kinds of things. I
Yeah.
mean, what's the likelihood of something like that would happen versus the whole, you know, phenomenon of frogs don't notice the water gradually getting too hot scenario?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
knowing that all of this is coupled with the lag time, right? That you talked
Yes.
about in the book too.
Yes. Well, yeah. Let me complicate it a little bit more, but first to answer your question, I think it's possible that could happen. I hope that happens. I hope things get bad enough soon enough
Yeah.
that people are shaken up enough that they say, we've got to come together to work on this problem. I really hope that happens. It doesn't have to be everybody, but it has to be enough.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, um, but we have to acknowledge there's another possibility. And that possibility is that when the stress level gets high enough because of environmental instability, uh, some percentage of us become even more susceptible to conspiracy theories and authoritarian thinking. And so in, you know, I'll give you an example. I worked for many years I was involved with refugee resettlement, and I worked a lot with Cambodian refugees. Uh, and in Cambodia, there was a revolution while the Vietnam War was going on called the Pol Pot regime. And what Pol Pot convinced, you know, millions of Cambodians of is that the problems in Cambodia were from the West, and the West influenced people by education. So believe it or not, Pol Pot convinced thousands of teenagers to go out and find anybody who was wearing glasses and to pull that person off a bus or pull that person off the street. And this sounds horrible, but it's true, and beat them to death, because if they had glasses on, it was a sign that they could read and that they were part of the Western educational imperial establishment that made them an enemy of the people, right? And
Wow.
and they believed that by killing anyone with Western background, even Cambodians who'd never left Cambodia but had a college education, by killing them, they would be strengthening the future of Canada, the only salvation of the future of Canada. So that kind of thing human beings are susceptible to.
Hmm.
And it's one of the reasons why, I'm also very concerned and active and outspoken about our current election season,
Yeah.
because that sort of thing doesn't just happen in Cambodia. It can happen in the United States. And it is happening in many, many places. I also have been marked for life because I was in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. So I got to see people from my own country be sucked into that kind of thinking. So this is, to me, it's not a cause for despair. It's a cause for realism. Yes, we could come together to solve this. And yes, we could miss our opportunity to do that, which makes us it makes us do things like publish a book called How to Heal Our Divides, right? To
Exactly.
try to face these realities.
Yeah. Yeah. So another question that came to mind to me when I was reading the book is, whether the fundamental issue is climate or whether it's greed.
Yeah. Yeah. I, I think the fundamental issue, I think both of those are deep, deep issues. I think, and I think greed is probably closer to it. We wouldn't have a climate crisis if we were acting
Yeah.
rationally.
Yeah.
Um, we're not acting rationally. We wouldn't have a climate crisis if we were acting ethically. And that, by the way, we wouldn't have we wouldn't have a race problem if
Mm.
we were
Yeah.
acting rationally and ethically. We wouldn't have had slavery. We wouldn't have had anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. So all of these things relate to some deep change that's needed in us. Um, and greed is an interesting word. As you know, I have a chapter in the book where I talk in some depth about the idea of addiction and how addiction might be an equally helpful or even better framing than greed.
Hmm.
Because, um, you might say greedy people are addicted to wealth, or they're addicted to more wealth, or they're addicted to having more than other people. But there's a certain sense that if you were to look at our civilization, you would say we are addicted to a couple of things. We're addicted to fossil fuels. Um, and whether we can break our addiction, we will make clear in the next few years. We're addicted to debt. It's how our society works. And to imagine an economy that isn't so stuck on debt. And you might say, well, what's wrong with debt? Well, one way to describe it is debt is when we take today's benefits from tomorrow's labor and wealth. And so this sense that we can't live on what we currently generate. At some point, that becomes a Ponzi scheme, where you're creating more and more fake wealth that you can't back up with real wealth. So all of those are to say that, yes, I think there is a problem here that comes down to human beings. I personally think human beings are very flexible. I think we could change in the direction we need to. Um, but even that requires work. So, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's why you do this podcast and conversation. And it's why I write books. We're trying to be involved in this work of helping the change that needs to happen in
Absolutely.
human beings. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, the example with debt, like so many things, strikes me as, one of these things that's susceptible to extremes.
Yes.
Right? Almost anything that I could think of,
Yeah.
if it's handled, I think you use the word ethically and rationally,
Yeah.
it's perfectly fine.
Yes.
It's when it gets to the extreme and it's driven,
Yes.
I would argue, by greed,
Yes.
that's when the wheels fall off.
Yes.
And you can
Yes.
say that about a lot of, capitalism. You can
Yes.
say it about socialism. You can say it
Yes.
about, any
Yes.
generic
Yeah.
construction that I
Yes.
think of is that,
Yeah.
there are some positive things about it if it's handled
Absolutely.
in an ethically and rational way, right? But when you get to the extremes, whether it's greed or something else, I don't know how to necessarily characterize it better, but that's the way I think of it. It's that.
I'm really glad you're bringing that up. I'm not saying every kind of debt is equally bad or that all debt is bad. Exactly. And in fact, there's a chapter, as you know, in the book called Maybe It's Good, Maybe It's Not, where one of the things I suggest is that to get through this mess, we're going to have to stop thinking in terms of simple binaries of good and
Yeah,
bad.
absolutely.
Um, because very often the very thing that helped me to get to this point could hurt me going forward. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean it didn't help me to get to this point. It just means it could really hurt me going forward. And so that requires adaptability and flexibility in us.
So what would be the number one thing you'd like folks to take away from the book?
Hmm. Well, I don't, I offer these four scenarios that I think it would be helpful for people to understand because I think all four of them are possible. And, uh, but I don't hope that people go away from the book saying, oh, now I've committed to which I think will happen. Um, I think what's more important is that we change our understanding of our relationship to the earth and to one another. Um, and that shift in consciousness, that shift in values is the thing that I hope will happen to people as they read the book.
Hmm.
Um, I suppose another way to say it is I hope when people are close the book, I hope they'll be able to say, I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know how I want to show up.
Hmm.
And that's, I think, in uncertain times, that's no small thing.
Absolutely. That's well said. So I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about, kind of the whole concept of finding your next calling.
Yes.
You were a pastor for many years and an author
Yes.
now for many years, which also means you've been a solo entrepreneur. Um,
Yes.
so what led you to kind of make that shift?
Yes. So I started as a pastor when I was 23, kind of officially. So I started pretty young. And after 24 years, I reached a point that a lot of people reach in midlife. I realized if I stayed in this work, I knew the outlines of it. I knew what I was good at. I knew what I was bad at and could possibly get better. And I knew what I was bad at and probably wasn't going to get better. And I had to decide if I wanted to keep doing those things,
Hmm.
um, uh, or if I was ready for some new adventure. Um, I didn't stop caring about church and spirituality, but I had this feeling because I'd written a couple of books that I might be able to do more help for my fellow pastors as a writer and a speaker to try to do some change in thinking and consciousness raising and movement building, so on, as a writer. And so I suppose the other thing that hit me about that time is I thought, I've been doing this for 24 years. There are some other people who this would be their new adventure, and I thought maybe I should move out of the way here and let somebody else have this adventure now. And I go off and start on some new adventure that other people might not be able to do. So that all of those were parts of the decision for me.
So, going through all the things you've gone through, since then, what have you learned in terms of discernment? Are there particular people or processes or other kinds of things that have now, looking back,
Yeah.
found to be very, very helpful for
Yeah.
you?
Well, so one of the things that I heard years and years ago that made a big difference for me when I first started my first career as a college English teacher, an older gentleman, the friend of a friend, said to me, Brian, my advice to you is in your first 10 years in your career, don't worry about money. Don't worry about earning money. Worry about earning a good reputation. If you earn a good reputation, the money will take care of itself. And so he gave me a real gift there because I was very poor. My wife and I had 4 kids, and I was making very, very little money. And uh, but I was so glad for that advice. And so I've focused less on money than I would have. That also made it possible for me when it came time at midlife to make that change. I didn't have a steady income. And so that's one piece. Another piece, someone said to me, don't make important decisions on your worst days. And I'm glad I stayed with my first career through an awful lot of, I mean, there were so many wonderful days, but I stayed through some tough times too. I'm glad I didn't quit when the times got tough. Um, what that allowed me to do is go through a much more thoughtful discernment process. And I remember in the period of time where I was deciding whether to leave or stay, my wife and I had some very deep talks. And it was interesting. For the first time, she said, I think it's time for you to move on. That was significant. I talked to my kids who at that time were in their late teens and early 20s. And they were like, whatever you want to do, Dad, but, uh, you know, you seem to really like this writing thing. And so, but I was interested in what my kids would have to say because I genuinely respected them and felt that they knew me. And I felt they genuinely cared about me, what was good for me. I talked to a whole number of friends, but I did something I'd never done in my whole life. I went to a therapist who also is a spiritual director. And a spiritual director is a person who tries to help people with a kind of spiritual discernment process. And when I went, he said, well, you're a minister. I give a cut rate to ministers. And I said, I don't want it. I don't want the discount. I want to pay you the full amount because I want you to be a professional. I don't want you doing any favors for me. I want the best of your professional services. And I'll tell you why that was significant for me, Brian. Everyone else in my life had some vested interest in what I would do, right? I talked to the leaders of my church about it, but I needed somebody who would try to just draw out everything they could from me, and they had no vested interest in the outcome. And it was the first time in my life I'd ever done that. And it was the first time in my life I realized how much I needed it. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but it
No,
was
I mean,
super helpful for me.
one of the things I've learned myself is relying on the advice of other people who
Yeah.
know me,
Yes.
know my background, know, what I'm good at or what I'm not good at or what I'm interested and not interested in. But as you said, don't really have a vested interest in,
Yes. And
and
I've watched you do that in just recent years. That's right.
yeah,
Exactly.
very consciously. I didn't think about it quite as consciously when I was younger, but yeah, I relied on that heavily now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's really invaluable. Of course, there's a lot of biblical wisdom leans in this direction. In the abundance of counselors, there is much wisdom. Sometimes people say,
Yeah, yeah.
in the abundance of counselors, there's much disagreement, which forces you to develop some wisdom. But even that is a very true thing.
Well, I mean, when you're going to interact with a lot of different people, you're going to get a lot of different input, right? So, I mean,
Yes.
a skill of vetting is
Yes.
incredibly
Exactly right.
necessary, right?
Yes.
To kind of decide, what you're hearing from the counselors, what plays and what doesn't, so
Yes. And I should say, regarding my decision to leave the pastorate, there's one other part of the story that's worth telling here. So I was going through this process. I hadn't reached a decision yet. And one of my staff members on whom I relied very heavily, and the only way I could be an author and do a lot of travel was because I took a pay cut and and worked, less than full time at the church. And then we were able to hire him, and he just did such a good job organizing things. And he came to me one day and he said, "Hey, Brian, I just want to let you know this. I was just approached about taking a job back in my hometown, and I know you really depend on me, so I'm going to say no. But I just wanted you to know I was hoping this job would come in 10 years, but I just wanted you to know." Well,
wow.
as soon as he said that, Brian, I just thought I should let him go, let him take that job. And we shouldn't hire somebody to replace him. We should hire somebody to replace me. And it was just like that became at that moment, months and months of discernment and thinking helped me in that moment just feel that that was the right thing to do.
Wow. Wow. Well, good for you for having, recognized that and thought through all the implications of it for, you know, both of you at that point.
And life sort of came together in a helpful way at that point.
So for people a little bit, less far along on their, entrepreneurial
Yes.
journey, so to speak, what kind of advice do you have for them?
I'll tell you, I don't know if you ever read this book. I wouldn't be surprised if you had, but there's a book. It's a business book, not a religious book. It's called The E Myth by Michael Gerber. E
Oh,
stands for entrepreneurial.
uh-huh.
And I remember I read that book when I was a pastor, not specifically about entrepreneurship, but I was actually a church planter, part of a group of people who started a new congregation. So even that was entrepreneurial work. And that book really helped me a lot, um, because it helped me understand both the blessing and curse, or the advantage and disadvantage of being an entrepreneur. And a oversimplified summary of one of Michael Gerber's key ideas is this: that you get into entrepreneurial work because you love something. You like baking cookies, so you want to have a cookie company. You like preaching sermons, so you start a church. You like uh, making monies or whatever it is, right? You like these things. But then you find out that there's a whole lot of work that's involved that you don't necessarily like. So the cookie baker finds out she might only work making cookies for 3 hours a day, but she has to do shopping and accounting for 7 hours a day, right? And what I think has what the way that book helped me is to realize the complexities of work, different kinds of work that go into running any successful endeavor. And that, and it's one of the reasons why building teams becomes so important, because you aren't going to like all the different kinds of work. You may need to do all the different kinds of work for the first few years in a startup, but uh, it's one of the reasons why the skill of building a team and appreciating team members is so important.
Yes, absolutely. That's really insightful. Thank you. So, I realize you're in the midst of, kind of an important book launch, but is there anything about the future that you can tell us about?
Mm. Well, it's a little soon to talk about this, but for the last 8 years, I've been working on some fiction. I've been working on a science fiction trilogy. So as soon as I finish this book tour, I have two of a trilogy written. The third one is sketched out, and I can't wait to start working on that. But for me, that's just been fun and sort of a wonderful indulgence.
Good for you. Well, another big departure, which, I mean, our one of our mutual friends, Patricia Raybon, recently, just a few years ago, launched her first fiction after having
Yes.
written, spiritual nonfiction for many years. And
Yes.
she loved it, and it's gone great. And so I'm sure it will for you too.
Well, thanks very much. Yeah. So that's something I'm looking forward to as well. Yeah.
Well, Brian, congratulations again on all your wonderful work. I really heavily encourage people to get this book. It's very important. You're going to learn a ton. You're going to find things in it that you're going to need to go research because you're going to be so interested in it. Um, Again, the title is Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. Go to brianmclaren.net and you can find out more about the book and where you can get it and everything else that Brian does. So, Brian, thank you so much for all that you do. Greatly
Oh
appreciate
man, the feeling is totally mutual. Great to be in this conversation with you, Brian.
it. Thank you.